everybody, this is B, and we are back again with Five Nights at Freddy's. Silver Eyes, we're on chapter 12, so we're almost done with this book. Sorry I paused for a bit and didn't upload lately. It's just I got super busy. Chapter 13 is going to be very, very short. So I might just read chapter 12 and 13 during this. I think that'd be a good blowout because I think chapter 13 just does 10 pages or so. So, here we go. They all stood staring at the man on the floor. Jessica took an involuntary step backward. Charlie was glued to the spot. She could not look away from him. Because I'm one of them, as if he could tell what she was thinking. John stepped up beside her. Charlie, he's insane, he said quietly, and it was enough to break her away from that dreadful, ecstatic gaze. She turned to John. We have to get out, she said. He nodded and turned back to the group and gestured to the walkie-talkie in his hand. I'm going back to the control room, he said. These things are police radios. There has to be a way to get them to reach the outside. Maybe I can use the equipment in there to get a signal somehow. I'll go with you, Charlie said instantly, but he shook his head. You have to stay with them, he said. He said, barely audible. Charlie looked over at Jessica and Carlton. He was right. Carlton needed someone with him, and Jessica was holding it together, but she couldn't be left alone in charge of the safety of both of them. Charlie nodded. Be careful, she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he tucked the walkie-talkie into his belt and gave her a wink and left. Clay Burke was in his office, reviewing the week's case files. There was not much. Traffic violations, two petty thefts, and one confession to murder of Abraham Lincoln. Clay shuffled through the papers and sighed. Shaking his head, he pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the file that had been plaguing him all morning. Freddys. When he closed his eyes, he was there again in the cheerful family restaurant, its floors streaked with blood. After Michael disappeared, he had worked 14-hour days, sometimes sleeping in the station. Every time he came home, he went to look at Carlton, who was usually asleep. He wanted to grab his son and hold him close, and never let him go. It could have been any of the children that day. It was blind, dumb luck that the killer had spared his own. At the time, it was the first murder that the department had dealt with. It was a 16-person department, usually charged with small thefts and noise complaints, and to be handed a gruesome murder made all of them feel a little like kids, whose toy guns had suddenly turned real. Clay opened the file, knowing what he would find. It was only a partial report. The rest of it was in storage room in the basement. He scanned the familiar words, the language that tried but failed to obscure the point. There had been no justice done. Sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, but it is the price we pay. He had said that to Charlie. He cringed a little now, realizing how that must have sounded to her, of all people. He picked up the phone and calling the front desk in a moment of urgency rather than walking the 20 feet to ask in person. Has Dunn reported back from Freddys? He asked again, before the officer on the other end could speak. No, sir, she said. He hung up, not waiting for her to finish. Clay stared restlessly at the wall for a long moment, then grabbed his coffee cup and headed to the basement. He didn't have to search for the box of evidence from the Freddys' disappearances. He had been here before. There was no one around, so instead of taking it upstairs to his office, Clay sat down on the concrete floor, spreading the papers and photographs around him. There were interviews, witness statements, and reports from on-scene officers, Clay included. He sifted through them aimlessly. He didn't know what he was looking for. There was nothing new here. There was nothing to find, really. They knew who did it. At first he had suspected Henry, just like so many others around town. It was a terrible thought, but it was a terrible crime. There was no solution that would not be shocking. He had not been the one to question Charlie's father, but he had read the transcript. The man had been almost incoherent, so shaken that he could not give a straight answer. He sounded as if he was lying, and to most people that was proof enough. But Clay had resisted, had delayed having him arrested, and sure enough, they came to William Afton, Henry's partner. Afton seemed like a normal one in the venture, the businessman. Henry was the artist. He always seemed to be off in another world, some part of his mind thinking about his mechanical creatures, even when he was holding a conversation about the weather or the kids' soccer games. There was something off about Henry, something almost shell-shocked. It seemed like a miracle that he could have produced a child as apparently normal as Charlie. Clay remembered when Henry had moved to town and begun construction of the new restaurant. Someone had told him that Henry had a kid who had been abducted several years prior, but he didn't know much else. He seemed like a nice enough guy, though he was obviously terribly alone, his grief visible even at a distance. Then Freddie Fazbear's opened and the town came to life. That was also when Charlie appeared. Clay hadn't known Henry even had a daughter until that day. William Acton was the one who made Freddys business, as he had the previous restaurant made Freddys a business. Acton was as robust and lively as Henry, with withdrawn and shadowy. He was a hefty man who had the ruddy geniality of a financially shrewd Santa Claus. And he had killed the children. Clay knew it. The whole department knew it. He had been present for each abduction, and he had mysteriously and briefly vanished at the same time as each child went missing. A search of his house had found a room crammed with boxes of mechanical parts and a musty yellow rabbit suit, as well as stacks of journals full of ravings, paranoia, passages about Henry that ranged from wild jealousy to near worship. But there had been no evidence. There had been no bodies, and so there could be no charge. William Afton had left town, and there was nothing to stop him. They did not even know where he had gone. Clay picked up the picture from the pile. It had been taken framed from the wall of Henry's office at the restaurant. It was a picture of the two of them together, Henry and William grinning into the camera in front of the newly opened Freddie Fazbear's. He stared at it. He had stared at it before. Henry's eyes did not quite match his smile. The expression looked forced, but then it always did. There was nothing unusual here except that one of the men had turned out to be a killer. Suddenly Clay felt a shock of recognition, something indistinct he could not quite catch. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander like a dog off the lead. Go on, find it. There was something about William, something familiar, something recent. Clay's eyes snapped open. He shoved everything back into the evidence box, cramming it in messily, keeping out only the photograph. Clutching it, he took the stairs up two at a time, almost running by the time he got to the main floor of the station. He headed straight for a particular filing cabinet, ignoring the grinning of his startled officers. He tore open the drawer, pawing through it until there it was, employee background checks requested by business from the last 6 months. He pulled out the stack and flipped through it, looking for photos. In the third folder, he found it. He picked up the picture and held it up next to the one of Henry and William, turning so his body did not block the light. It's him. The background check application was labeled Dave Miller, but it was unmistakably William Afton. Afton had been fat and affable. The man in the picture was sallow and thin, his skin saggy and his expression unpleasant, as if he had forgotten how to smile. He looked like a poor I can't talk right now, of himself, or maybe Clay thought he looked like he had dropped his disguise. Go check this. Go check this. Gotta check this. Sorry guys, you heard me say gotta check this. I was looking for something, but I can't find it. I was gonna bring up a photo. Clay flipped the page back to see why the check had been requested, and his face drained white, his breathing stopping for a moment. Clay stood, grabbing his jacket in the same motion, then stopped. Slowly he sat, letting the jacket fall from his fingers. He took the partial file back out of his drawer, and delicately he lifted one of the photos out. It had been taken in the aftermath. when the place was no more than a crime scene. He paused for a moment, closed his eyes, then he looked again at the picture, willing himself to see it as if for the first time. There was a glimmer of light he had never noticed before. One of the animatronics on stage, the bear. Freddy was looking towards the cameraman, one of his eyes illuminated with a smear of light. Oh my god. Clay put the picture aside, moving to the next one. This one was from a different angle, but the side of the main stage was still in the frame. Chica's body was facing away from the camera, but her face was turned directly towards it, and another smear of light streaked across her left eye. Clay rubbed it with the tip of his finger, making sure it wasn't a defect in the paper. The next photo showed Bonnie in the darkness behind the chairs. A pinpoint of light, like a star, shone from one of his eyes as though reflecting a spotlight that wasn't there. What is that? Clay could feel his face flush. He realized he hadn't been breathing. He shuffled his hands on the desk like a conjurer calling forth to picture reveal itself. One did. The last picture had been taken in Pirate's Cove. Tables had been disturbed, he remembered. The scene was chaotic. The tables and chairs in a disarray, clutter strewn through the halls. But unlike so many other times he had stared at the picture, he ignored the disorder, focused only on stage. The curtain was pulled back slightly, a figure barely visible in the recesses behind it, one eye presumably illuminated by the flash of the camera. Clay studied the rest of the pictures, looking for more reflections, but found none. There was no flash. Jason opened his eyes. His legs hurt. It was steady, dull pain. He flexed it tenderly and found he could move easily. The injury could not be too bad. He was lying on something lumpy. His whole body felt stiff, like he had been asleep on a pile of. He looked at what he was lying on, a pile of extension cords and wires. He sat up. It was dark, but he could dimly see what was around him. He bent over and examined his leg. His jeans were ripped where Foxy's claw had gouged him, and a gash in his leg was ugly, but it was not bleeding badly. The hook had mostly got a hold of his jeans. Jason felt a little relief, satisfied. He began to examine his surroundings. He was in a corner, and there was a heavy black curtain strung from one wall to the other, cutting the stage off from the room outside. He crawled forward over the cables cautiously, careful to make no sound. He made his way to the edge of the curtain, where there was a tiny sliver of gap between it and the wall. Jason took a moment to steel himself, then peeked out, conscious of his every movement. He was on the small stage in Pirate's Cove, behind the curtain. He could hear something moving out there, something large, but from his position he could only see an empty room. He pushed his head out a little farther, craning his neck to look. He couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but with each second he grew bolder, readying himself to leap from the stage and run. A light was pulsing in the main dining room, illuminating the hall for a brief second at a time with bright, dizzying carnival colors. It wasn't much, but it gave Jason a direction to run. He watched it intently until it was all he could see, and then it stopped. The room was dark, darker than it had been before. His eyes had adjusted to the light, and now he was nearly blind. The shuffling sound went on, and Jason pulled the curtain open farther. This time he moved too fast, and as the curtain was drawn, the metal rings that held it clinked together. The light above Pirate's Cove went on. Foxy was there, right in front of him. His face was so close to Jason that he could almost touch. Jason scrambled back through the curtain, pulling it closed again, trying to escape the small alcove, but there was nowhere to run. He crawled backwards, staying against the wall, hoping that the curtain would somehow shield him from Foxy. At once, the curtain began to open, not by force, but as if a show were about to begin. Lights and colors flashed in silent patterns, and the glittered front curtains rolled back in grand fashion to reveal the stage, with the beast standing patiently at its base. Foxy cocked his head to the side as if considering something, then he began his approach. He climbed the stairs to the stage one by one, each step a whole series of disjointed movements, as if each piece of his metal body maneuvered itself individually. Jason watched, struck with horror, and yet some small part of him was enthralled. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Foxy reached the stage and took 2 more large, deliberate steps until he was standing over Jason. Jason stared up at him, too afraid to move, frozen in place like a mouse beneath a diving falcon. His breath was shallow, his heart beat so fast his chest hurt. Foxy raised his hook again, and Jason threw himself down on the floor in a ball, protecting his head with his arms, waiting for the blow to come. It did not come. Jason did not move. He waited and waited, wondering if time had slowed down as he approached the moment of his death. His mind trying to give him refuge, making the last moments feel as long as possible. But not this long. He opened his eyes and turned his head a little, keeping his arms in front of him. Foxy was still there, not moving. Despite himself, Jason met the creature's eyes. It was like looking into the sun. Foxy's burning gaze made Jason's eyes tear up, made him want to look away, but he could not. It was the animatronic who looked away. As Jason watched, peering through the afterburn that clouded his vision, Foxy turned to face his absent audience. His hook fell slowly to his side, his head tilted forward, and he went motionless. The sound of whirring machinery and clicking parts came to a stop, and the curtains drew closed again. "Ready?" Lamar said. Marla nodded curtly. "I'm ready," she said. She threw open the door, fists clenched, and they climbed out, facing opposite directions, preparing for the assault. Marla was breathing heavily, her face furious. The darkness was thick and almost tangible, and she could barely make out what was around her. She could see Lamar, but if they drifted 3 feet apart, they would be lost to each other. The lights above them flickered, but only for a moment. The brief illumination ruined what little night vision they had, making the dark impenetrable. "Isn't anything on your side?" Marla whispered. Lamar looked toward her, distressed. "No. Anything on your side?" "Light, please," Marla whispered. Lamar held up the flashlight as though aiming a weapon and turned it on. Above them, the light sputtered. Jason could see their flashlight waving back and forth, filtering through the slightly transparent curtain. Oh no. The light fell on the animatronic just for a moment, and there was a clicking noise. Jason looked up. Foxy was not moving. The light swept across him again, and the mechanical sound came, this time unmistakable, though he still did not move. Jason scooted forward around Foxy's foot, and he looked up at the animatronic's face as the light struck him again. Again the clicking noise came. Something inside him was righting itself, but his eyes stayed dark. Jason crawled as far forward as he was willing to venture, trying not to cross into Foxy's line of sight. He made it to the edge of the curtain and reached his arm out to wave a warning. "Jason!" he heard his sister's voice, and then a quick shushing from what must have been Lamar. The flashlight swept up, trained on the stage, and Foxy's eyes lit up. His head swept towards the light with a predatory precision, and Jason panicked, reached for the pile of cords, and grabbed a cable. Foxy lifted a foot, and Jason threw the cord around it and yanked with all his strength. Foxy pitched forward, grabbing at the curtain with his hook. It caught, ensnaring him, and he ripped through the cloth with a vicious tearing noise, falling to the ground in a tangle of cloth and metal limbs. Jason scrambled past the struggling creature and ran towards the light. Marla reached for him, but he brushed her aside. "Run," he panted, and the 3 of them took off down the hall. They turned a corner, and as one they stopped, Jason skidding against Lamar and grabbing him for support. At the end of the dark hall stood another figure, too large to be a person. The top hat was unmistakable. Freddy Fazbear. His eyes were illuminated, their piercing red glow consuming the space around him. They could hear the brittle notes of the song, mechanical and thin like a music box, coming from Freddy's direction. They stared mesmerized. Then Jason found himself and pulled at Marla's arm. "Come on," he hissed, and they followed, running back the way they had come. When they reached Pirate's Cove, they slowed. Foxy had thrown off the curtain and was beginning to right himself. The 3 exchanged glances, then ran past him. Jason held his breath until they were through to the next doorway, invoking some kind of superstition. Lamar motioned to one of the party rooms, and they ducked inside. He switched off the flashlight, and they stood still for a moment, their eyes adjusting. The room had 3 long cafeteria-style tables, each one still set for a party. Metal folding chairs were lined all up and down them, and each place was set with a party hat, a paper plate, and a plastic cup. By wordless agreement, each hid beneath a different table, leaving themselves as much space as possible. They crouched low, hoping to be lost behind the chair legs, and together they stared silently into the vacant hall and listened. Hello? Anyone? John repeated into the radio, but there was only static. He had managed to hook the walkie-talkie into the sound system, but getting a signal to the outside seemed impossible. Freddys was sealed off from the world. He looked at the monitors again. On one screen he could see 3 figures crouched under tables. Lamar, Marla, and Jason, he thought. They found Jason, he realized with profound relief, letting go of a tension he had not known he felt. Everything on screen was lit with unnatural grays and whites. There must be a night vision camera. These must be the night vision cameras, he said to no one, squinting to see through the static. He watched the blurry figures crawl and come to a stop beneath the long party tables. Then movement from another screen caught his eye. There was a figure in the hallway, moving steadily towards the room they were in. John could not tell what it was, but the way it moved wasn't human. It stopped beside a doorway, and with a sudden jolt of realization, John looked again at the party room where his friends were hiding. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and flipped the speaker system on, jamming the volume control as high as it would go. Lamar, he said calmly, trying to sound commanding. He heard the vibrations of his own voice through the walls of the control room. Lamar, don't move. John's voice blared over the speakers, blurred with static, but intelligible. Lamar, don't move. Lamar, Marla, and Jason looked at each other across the distance between the tables. The room lit up with burning red glow, and they watched, as still as they could be, as Freddy Fazbear entered the room. His movements were mechanical and graceless as he walked with deliberate steps to the middle of the room, stopped between 2 tables, Marla on one side, Jason on the other. Jason looked at his sister, and she put a finger to her lips. Jason hadn't realized that there were tears on his cheeks until now. He watched as Freddy surveyed the room. His head, with eyes like spotlights, whirred to one side, stopped with a click, then turned to the other side. There was a long pause. The 2 padded feet were motionless, the legs like black trees in the forest. There was a sound of twisting fur and crinkling fabric. And the feet began to pivot. Freddy turned around and headed for the door, each step shaking the floor beneath him. As Freddy passed by, Jason shrank back instinctively, his foot hitting one of the metal chairs. It made a scraping sound. Jason's heart raced. Frantic, he looked across the space at Marla, who beckoned to him urgently. Freddy had stopped, but they could still hear the sound of fabric and fur scrunching and moving. Freddy began to bend down. His motions were slow, and in those precise few seconds, Jason pushed the 2 chairs in front of him apart, making a gap just wide enough for him to be able to crawl behind Freddy as soon as he had the chance. The light of Freddy's eyes came into view under the table, illuminating the space beside Jason, and he quickly but quietly crawled between the chairs to where Marla was hiding. Freddy stood again, training his eyes on the floor, just as Jason pulled his foot out of sight. Freddy began to pivot towards the table they were under. Marla put a hand on Jason's arm, steadying him. There was another pause. Lamar, under the opposite table, beckoned to Marla and Jason, urging them to his own table, farther away from Freddy. Marla shook her head, not wanting to risk making a noise. Maybe he's leaving, she told herself. Jason was beginning to breathe normally again when it struck them. Freddy was ducking down again, this time silently. His eyes had gone dark, but as soon as they spotted him, his gaze lit up again, illuminating the room. Marla and Jason scrambled around the metal chairs as fast as they could without touching them. They crawled across the thin carpet between tables until they came across an opening in the chairs and crawled under the table beside Lamar. Marla and Lamar looked at each other at a loss. Freddy was straightened up again and began to circle around the 3rd table. We have to run for the door, Marla whispered. Lamar nodded, then motioned for them to follow his lead. He watched, waiting until Freddie was bending down once again, and then gestured to the middle table. They caught their breath, trying not to gasp, and Lamar looked towards the door. Could they make it? Lamar put a hand on Jason's shoulder, and he started to shrug her off, but she was gripping him tightly, her fingers digging into him. He moved to brush her away, then looked at her. She was terrified, even more than he was. He let her hold on to him while keeping his eyes on Freddie, waiting for the next opening. It didn't come. As they waited, poised for flight, Freddie turned away, his deliberate steps taking him to the doorway. The room went dark, and Jason's heart skipped before he understood what had happened. The lights were gone because Freddie was gone. Marla, he whispered, his voice a little more than a breath of air. He's gone. Marla looked at him and nodded, but she did not let go of his shoulder. Are you okay? She asked in the same almost soundless way. He nodded, then pointed to his leg and shrugged theatrically. She smiled at him and took her hand from his shoulder to muss his hair. Suddenly, Lamar was tapping Marla's arm. He pointed to his ear, and she gave him a puzzled look. Jason stiffened, realizing what it was, and in a second Marla did too. There was music in the room, a tiny labored sound like a music box, the gap between the notes just a little too long. The room lit up again, a drowning red, and before they could move, the table was wrenched away. Freddie stood over them. He shoved the table aside, almost hurling it. They screamed, not a scream for help, but the last futile act of defiance. Jason clung to his sister, and she pulled his head down against her, shielding his eyes so he would not have to see. Suddenly, Freddie stumbled off balance and lurched to the side. He tried to right himself, but another jolt from behind sent him flying forward, falling face first into the tables. Marla, Lamar, and Jason looked up to see Charlie and John, their faces flushed with effort. Come on, Charlie said. Let's go. Dave shrugged out of his bonds quickly. The knots were sturdy, but the cords had too much give. A few twists and turns, and he was free. He crawled to the door on his hands and knees and held his ear to the crack, careful not to jostle the door and give himself away. The loudspeaker blared, and then the sound he had been waiting for. Footsteps running away. He waited just until the sound faded, then got purposefully to his feet. Where are we going? Marla panted as they raced back towards the main dining room. The office, she called. It's got a real door. We can barricade ourselves in. She glanced at John, who nodded shortly. What they would do once they were barricaded inside was another question, but they could worry about that once they were safe. They ran through the dining room. Charlie glanced at the stage, blurred in passing, but she saw what she knew she would. It was empty. They reached the narrow hall and led to the office, and Charlie's heart lifted when she saw the door, light shining from its small window like a beacon. Wait, light? She slowed her pace. They were 10 feet from the door. She lifted a hand, signaling the others to stop, and they approached the door slowly. Steeling herself, Charlie grabbed the knob and turned. It was locked. She looked helplessly at the others. Someone's in there, Jason whispered, moving closer to Marla. There's no one else here. Wait, where's Jessica? There's no one else here, Marla said softly, but it sounded like a question. Charlie was about to try the door again, but stopped herself. Oh, sorry. Don't draw their attention. He got loose, Jessica said, her voice hoarse, and Charlie felt a chill. She's right. She didn't say it. We have to go back, she said. Without waiting for a response, she turned, pushing between Lamar and John to take the lead. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped dead, as she heard the others gasp. It was Chica, her eyes like burning orange headlights. She stood at the other end of the short hall, blocking their only way out. Her body filled the space. They could not even try to run past her. Charlie glanced behind her, even though she knew there was no other way out. Before she could react, John was running at the animatronic. He had no weapons, but he hurled himself towards the thing and leaped up, trying to grab a hold of her neck. He caught it briefly, struggling to hold on as Chica thrashed her head back and forth. Chica bent forward and swung to the side, slamming John into the wall. and John let go, crumpling to the floor. The cupcake on Chica's platter snapped its mouth as if laughing. Its eyes rolled in their tiny sockets. John, Charlie cried as she thrust the flashlight back for someone else to take it. She felt its weight leave her hands, but she didn't look back to see who took it. She looked up. There was an electrical cord dangling above their heads. Parts of the rubber had worn away, exposing stretches of bare wire. Chica was slowly advancing. Charlie jumped up, but she could not see high enough to reach it. She looked to either side. Is it narrow enough? She glanced at Chica. She was moving slowly, with the measured steps they were trapped, and she did not need to hurry. Charlie planted one foot against the wall, then stretched her leg across the narrow hallway and did the same on the other side, bracing herself between the walls to climb. She inched upward, her legs shaking with the effort. She looked up, struggling to retain her balance as she reached for the cord. Careful to touch only the rubber, she closed her fingers around it and dropped to the ground. Chica lunged forward, her arms extended, her teeth contorted into a mechanical smile. Charlie sprang up, the electrical cord brandished in front of her, and she shoved it into the space between Chica's head and her torso. Chica jerked back, sparks flying, and for a horrible moment Charlie could not move. Her hand throbbed with the electric current, and she was caught there, unable to make her hand let go of the wire. She stared down at it, willing her fingers to open. Is this how I die? Lamar grabbed her and pulled her away, and she looked up at him, wide-eyed. The others were already running. Chica was deactivated, or so it appears, slumped forward, and her eyes dark. Lamar gave her arm a tug, and they took off after the others. With a pleased smile, Dave watched the confrontation through the window in the office door. Just a matter of time now, he thought. The girl had been clever, climbing the walls like that, but she had almost killed herself. They could not last much longer. All he had to do was wait. Suddenly the room was lit with an ethereal blue. He froze, then slowly turned. Bonnie. The animatronic towered over him, close enough to touch. Dave fell back against the door and screamed. There was a scream from the direction of the office. The group paused for a moment and looked nervously at one another. It doesn't matter, Charlie said. Come on. She took a quick look back at Chica, who was still slumped forward, inert. Charlie led them into the main dining room. As they emerged, there was a sudden movement. Foxy was there. He leaped onto the table in front of them, looking among them until his silver eyes lit on Jason. He crouched as if he were about to jump on the boy. Charlie grabbed a napkin dispenser and threw it as hard as she could. It struck Foxy's head, glancing off with little effort, but it was enough to get his attention. He turned to her and pounced. Charlie was already running, racing to lure him away from the others. Then what? She thought as he ran furiously out of the dining room and down the hall. The arcade. It was dark. There was things to hide behind. She kept running full out until she reached the door, then turned so fast she almost fell, hoping to give Foxy's movement a disorientation. She looked around frantically. There was a row of arcade machines at the back of the room, set out just a little from the wall. She heard footsteps behind her and dove for it. The space was so tight she could barely squeeze herself into it. Her sides were pressed between the consoles and the wall, and there were thick coiled wires beneath her feet. She took a step back, moving deeper into the crawl space, but her foot slipped on the cable and she barely kept from falling. Movement in the room caught her eye. She saw a flash of silver. Light. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled backwards, scooting inch by inch. Her foot caught on the cable when she stopped to free it, twisting into an impossible position to quietly dislodge it. She moved back farther, and then her foot bumped against another wall, and she stopped. She was closed in on three sides, and almost felt safe. She closed her eyes for a moment. Nothing here is safe. There was an awful sound, a clash of metal hitting metal, and the console at the far end of the row rocked on its foundation, banging back against the wall. Foxy leaned over it, and now Charlie could see him as he smashed the display, spilling shards of plastic into the floor. His hook caught on something inside the machine, and he yanked it out again, trailing bits of wire. He moved on to the next game, smashing the screen and throwing the console against the wall with casual brutality. Charlie felt the impact of the echoing through the wall as he moved closer. I have to get out. I have to. But there was no way out. Now that she was sitting in one place, she realized that her arms were stiff with pain. Only now did she look at it. The bandage was soaked through with blood. The wall beside her was streaked with a line of where her arm had pressed. She wanted to cry suddenly. Her whole body ached, the wound in her arm, the constant tension of the last day or so. Who could tell how long it had been? Was draining her, taking all she had. The next console crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. It was only two away. He was almost to her. She could hear his gears working, humming, grinding, and sometimes screeching. She closed her eyes, but she could still see him, his matted fur and the metal bones showing through the searing silver eyes. The console beside her was wrenched away and tumbled to the ground like it weighed nothing at all. The cords beneath Charlie's hand and knees jerked forward with it, and she slipped, grabbing at nothing and trying to regain her balance. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. She moved faster than she could think. She hurled herself at the final console with all her strength, and it balanced precisely, then fell, knocking Foxy to the ground and trapping him. Charlie started to run, but his hook shot out and snared her leg, cutting into her. She screamed, falling to the ground. She kicked at him and with her other foot, but his hook was stuck deep in her leg. Every time he jerked back, she felt the impact. She kicked him in the face, and his hook tore free, slicing open her leg. She screamed again, instinctively grabbing the wound, and then Foxy was on top of her, snapping his jaws and clawing her as he tried to free his legs from under the console. She fought back, struggling to get away. His hook slashed at her again and again as she tried to block the blows, screaming for help. Suddenly, John was there. He stood over Foxy and stomped down hard on the creature's neck, holding his foot there. Foxy flailed but could not reach him. "Charlie, get up," he called. Charlie just stared at him for a second, too shaken to register the question. He stamped his foot on Foxy's neck repeatedly, then in one quick movement, he grabbed Charlie's hand, heaved her up, started to run, pulling her along behind him. They made it to the main dining room, where the rest of the group was huddled in the middle of the room. Relieved, Charlie rushed to join them. She could tell she was limping, but she did not feel any pain, which she realized somewhere dimly in the back of her mind was not good. When they got to the others, her heart sank. Their faces were grim. Lamar was holding the flashlight out in front of him, but it rattled in his trembling grip. Marla gestured quickly to the entrances. Freddie stood in the hall to the storage room, while Bonnie now blocked the hallway to the office. Chica, reanimated, stood on stage, looming over them. Charlie glanced back at the way they had come. Foxy was approaching. He had freed himself. He stopped in the doorway, as if waiting for a signal. There was no escape. Suddenly, acutely aware of everything around her, Charlie noticed the sound of the music box, as if she had unconsciously been hearing it all along. She took a deep breath. The moment seemed to go on forever. It had come to this. They were trapped. They waited. Now, perhaps for the animatronics, there was no hurry. Charlie cast her eyes around futilely for a weapon, but there was only party hats and paper plates. As one, the animatronics started their approach. Charlie grabbed the back of the metal folding chair, not sure if she could even use it. The animals were moving faster now, coming in unison, as if this battle was a choreographed dance. Marla took Jason's hand and whispered something in his ear. Whatever it was, he shook his head, set his jaw, and balled his hands into a fist. Lamar glanced at him for a moment, but said nothing. Jessica had her hand stiffly at her side, and she was murmuring something to herself inaudibly. "Where's Carlton?" The animals were almost on top of them. Freddie's trundling walk was predatory, and the music box notes were coming from Freddie's direction. From inside Freddie, she now realized. Chica leaped from the stage and took small bouncing steps towards them, as if excited but holding herself back. Bonnie's big paw-like feet slapped the ground like a challenge, and Foxy slunk forward with malevolent grace, his eyes fixed on Charlie as if she was the only thing he saw. She gazed into his silver eyes. They filled her vision, crowding out everything else until the world was silver. The world was Foxy's eyes, and there was nothing left of her. John squeezed her hand. It broke the spell. She looked at him, her vision still cloudy. Charlie, he said, haltingly. Charlotte, shh, she said, later. He nodded, accepting the lie that there would be a later. Foxy crouched down again, and Charlie let go John, her heart pounding as she braced for it. Foxy's joints shifted in their sockets as he prepared to spring, then stopped. Charlie waited. There was no screams from behind her, no sounds of fighting. Even the music box had gone silent. Foxy was motionless, though his eyes still glowed. Charlie looked around, and then she saw. It was Freddie. Not the one they all knew, not the one who stood less than a foot away from Marla, his mouth open as if poised to bite. It was the other one, the one she remembered, the yellow Freddie from the diner. The costume her father used to wear. It was looking at them, staring from the corner, and now she heard something. It was indistinct, just whispers in her head, a gentle shh blowing through her conscious mind without taking hold. She looked at the others and knew they heard it too. But the meaning was unmistakable. Carlton was the one to say it. Where was he? Michael? The sound they heard grew warm, and unspoken confirmation. Together they approached the Golden Bear. Marla brushed past Brown Freddie as if he were not there, and Charlie turned her back to Foxy, unafraid. There was only one thought in her mind. Michael, it's you. They were almost to him. All Charlie wanted to do was fling her arms around him, hold him close, and be again the little girl she was so long ago. To embrace him again, this beloved child who had been ripped from their lives on that carefree afternoon. To do it all over again. This time to rescue him, this time to save his life. Michael, she whispered. The yellow bear stood motionless. Unlike the others, there seemed to be nothing inside of it. It stood of its own accord, by its own will. There was nothing to hold the costume jaw closed, and its eyes were empty. Suddenly aware that their backs were to the other animatronics, Charlie startled and turned apprehensive. Freddie, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy stood at rest, almost as if they were back on their stages. Their eyes were locked on Charlie, but they had halted their approach. It's the kids, Carlton whispered. Foxy wasn't attacking Jason, Marla guessed. Foxy was trying to protect him. John took hesitant steps towards the middle of the dining room. Then they approached more boldly, looking at each of the robots in turn. It's the kids, he echoed. All of them. Their faces were no longer animalistic, no longer lifeless, as if some spirit inhabited them. Suddenly there was a crash from the sealed exit door. They all startled, turning as one as the wall beside the welded entrance shook with the force of a dozen blows. Now what? Charlie thought. The brick broke and fell, scattering in pieces across the floor, dust filling the air, and dusty clouds. A figure stepped through the hole, wielding a massive sledgehammer, and as the air slowly cleared, they saw who it was. Clay Burke, Carlton's father. His eyes set on Carlton, and he dropped the hammer and ran to his son, sweeping him into an embrace. Clay stroked his hair, gripping him like he would never let go. Charlie watched from her distance, relief touched by the stiletto edge of envy. Dad, I'm gonna puke, Carlton murmured. Clay laughed, but leaned back when he saw that Carlton wasn't kidding. He bent over, hands on his knees, fighting the urge to retch, and Clay's face took on alarm. Carlton straightened. I'm good. Clay was not listening anymore. He was looking around the room at the animals. All of them were frozen in time, displayed. Okay, kids, Clay said, his voice low and his words careful. I think it's time for us to go. He stared towards the exit he had made. They glanced at each other. The whispers were gone. Whatever he had been, the yellow Freddy was slouched again, an empty suit, though no one had seen it move. Charlie nodded toward Clay, and the rest started forward, heading almost reluctantly to the hole in the wall. Charlie hung back. John stayed beside her, but she gestured him forward, taking up the rear. She had barely had time to take a step when something took hold of her throat. Charlie tried to cry out, but her windpipe was being crushed. She was whipped around as if she weighed nothing, and she found herself face to face with the yellow rabbit. Davis, Dave's eyes were shining through triumphantly. He had his arms around her neck, squeezing her throat so tightly that she could scarcely breathe. He held her so close it was almost an embrace. She could smell the costume, stained fur, and years of putrid sweat, blood, and cruelty. He spoke still staring at Charlie. You are staying. Absolutely not, Clay said, taking on the group's authority. Dave dug his fingers deeper into Charlie's neck, and she made a strangled sound. I will kill this one, right here, while you watch, unless you do as I say, he said, his voice almost pleasant. Clay looked at him for a long moment, calculating, then nodded. Okay, he said, his voice calm. We'll do as you say. What do you want? Good, Dave said. He relaxed his grip on Charlie's neck, and she took a shaky breath. Clay began to move forward towards them, and the others followed. Charlie looked up at the man in the rabbit suit, and he met her gaze. It was you. You killed Michael. You killed Sammy. You took them from me. His eyes should have held something fierce and dangerous. They should have been windows to a rotting core inside, but they were only eyes, flat and empty. Charlie plunged her hands into the gap between the costume's head. Dave drew back, but she held on. If you want to be one of them, then be one of them, she shouted, and tripped the spring locks. Dave's eyes widened, and then he screamed. Charlie jerked her hands free, barely evading the locks as they snapped open and plunged into his neck. She took a step back, watching as Dave crumpled to the ground, still screaming as the costume released. Part by part, the animatronic insides pierced his flesh, ripping up his organs, tearing through his body as if it were not even there. At some points, he stopped screaming, but he still writhed on the floor for what felt like long minutes before he was still. Charlie stared, breathing hard as if she had been running. The, the form on the ground seemed unreal. John was the first to move. He came beside her, but still staring down, she waved him off before he could touch her. She could not bear it if he did. Jessica gasped as they all looked up. The animatronics were moving. The group drew back, huddling together, but none of the animals were looking at them. One by one, they took hold of the broken body on the floor and began to drag it away towards the hall to Pirate's Cove. As they disappeared down the hallway, Charlie noticed that the yellow Freddy was gone. Let's go, she said quietly. Clay Burke nodded, and they filed out the restaurant for the last time. And I said I was going to do chapter 13, but I think I'm not. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.